This episode is brought to you by Elevate OS, the only all-in-one community operating system. Elevate OS transforms property management, combining resident engagement, reservations, rent payments, maintenance, and concierge services into a single super app. It also uniquely integrates access control, intercoms, package lockers, and thermostats, eliminating app fatigue and redefining modern apartment living. Visit elevateos.com/MMN for a free demo and see how they can help you level up your operations. Welcome to another episode of the Multifamily Collective. It is that time of the week again where you go and grab your favorite beverage, and I do the same. Today, I'm doing Hugo Coffee Roasters, roasted in Park City, Utah. This is the Bonafide Dark Roast, Bonafido. I see what you did there. Dark Roast, and each bag sold contributes to animal rescue. So that is a great cause. That is what I am drinking today. Had the opportunity to sit down with Dom Beveridge from 20 for 20 to go through the 2025 edition of the 2420 rather, annual survey. And this was a fascinating conversation, as it is every year. I think this is the fourth or fifth year running where I've had an opportunity to sit down and interview Dom based on the feedback that he gathered from the survey. There were some really interesting surprises this year, things that I think that you'll want to take note of. So grab your favorite pen or pencil or remarkable pen, smart pen, whatever you take notes with. Grab that and get ready. There was an interesting observation that Dom made as it relates to the customer journey and how the customer journey, a lot of companies don't even understand what their customer journey is today. And it's the result of a couple of key things that Dom will talk about in this interview, or he does talk about in this interview. A surprising surge in renewal rates. So renewal percentages or retention rates have gone up, and he discloses the reasons, or at least some reasons, why he thinks that is happening. So we touch on revenue management. We touch on some of the key buzzwords in the industry today, be it AI or centralization, PropTech, a lot of buzzwords, a lot of buzzy buzzwords that we throw around. Nevertheless, Dom just has a great grip on this information, and this information positioned against or juxtapositioned against prior surveys. So his thought process is ever evolving. And you'll see that a couple of times he says in the interview that, hey, I used to think about it this way, but based on all the research I've done this past 12 months or this past 8 months, I'm starting to think about something a little bit differently. So you'll see that, or you'll hear that in the conversation about centralization. So again, grab your favorite beverage, grab your favorite writing utensil, your favorite piece of paper or digital note-taking application, and get ready and enjoy this conversation with the great Dom Beveridge. Hey, Dom, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Great to be back.
Yeah, I think this is our fourth or fifth installment of discussion over the 2420. 25, this is the 25 edition, but I think we've done the starting back in 20 or 21. Can't remember. Do you remember?
I mean, I can't remember when the recording started, but I do remember you were the first ever interview back at the end of 2018 that we did.
I remember that. I remember sitting at a table, and I was very excited about AI leasing agents, I think.
Yes.
At the time.
Yes.
If you could classify it that way. Well, Tom, let me start by saying that I'm always excited, and I anticipate the 20 for 20 paper coming out every single year. And I think I've sent you like screenshots or like pictures over text messages like, hey, I like all these markups that I do and questions that I write down. I really do dig the information. I know it's well researched and it's well written, and just extension of thanks for doing it, because it really does help a person get a lot of insight for the industry.
Thank you.
Yeah. I want to start by the paper kind of sets the idea that 2025 is starting to look more rosy or positive, and by extension 26 and 27 might look a little more positive. But what were the positive sentiments that you found that people were communicating to you?
Well, it really felt like 2025 was like what people expected the middle of 2024 to be like when we asked them the same questions a year earlier. You know, there was this at the end of 2023. there was this whole survive to 25 thing that people kept talking about. That was probably a sort of optimistic condensing of 2 years into a single year. So, the end of 2024, 1 year later, really feels like we're halfway through what people thought was coming in 2024. So what that means is people were sort of cautiously positive that, by some point in late 2025, the excess supply is going to burn off. The interest rate environment will probably get better. Properties will start to trade again. We can start to refocus on performance, and the deal pipeline will start up again. So that was a sort of positivity, but the big caveat is that it just generally feels like a slog, right? It's people sort of know, people have more of a sense that they know where this thing is going, but they still have a lot of adversity to get through before they
Yeah, it's interesting. Somebody said that survive until 25, but then I can't remember what they said about 26.
it was be in the mix in 26 or something like
Yeah, there
that.
it was.
Yeah.
You got it.
Which may still be a good way to think about it, but yeah, that's I think that there was some optimism in people's timelines when we thought about this at the end of 23.
Yeah, it does seem like it. Who knows? It's a little bit of licking your finger and waving it in the air to
Mm-hmm.
speculate as to when it will actually thaw out and start moving again. But if you look historically, every cycle starts up sometime, and it does seem like it's the indication. It seems to me that you get the election. The election is now out of the way. There's still a little uncertainty in the market as it relates to tariffs on, tariffs off, or retaliatory or whatever. But I think once that sort of looks a little more clear, then who knows? Maybe that's the catalyst that kicks off the next wave to come. I'm interested rather. There is a lot of money in the system. I'm going to ask you a question about PropTech, but a lot of money in the system, a lot of PropTech created as a result of a lot of money being in the system. But it seems like that tide is shifting a little bit. Do you think 25, 26 is a year of M&A, or hey, you have to start to prove out your P&L, or you might have to go away?
You mean prop tech companies?
Yes, specifically PropTech companies.
Yeah, I think it will be. I think it's you're going to get a lot of consolidation in 2025. I can think of numerous companies that have been for sale but have failed to find buyers. So that just tells me that there's a lot of companies out there that are not going to achieve the ambition that they had at the outset and are looking for whatever exit they can find. I mean, there is just this brute fact. It's a really big theme through this year's research is that just loads more companies have been funded. And what happens when way more companies are getting funded, like the size of this industry is somewhat finite, right? So if it's just more and more prop tech companies are getting funded, that just means you kind of got the same number of leaders. You've mostly created more followers in those markets. So those companies that are not going to be the stellar like exits are going to get rolled up by other organizations. Brad Hargraves wrote a great Substack on this a month or so ago that he was talking about the stuck generation, which is this really, really, really large cohort of tech companies that are, maybe they're even like profitable, but the growth just isn't going to be there for everybody, which just means you're going to find lots and lots of technology getting rolled up by bigger organizations. So yeah, I think that's extremely likely to play out in 2025.
Do you think so? I think of fraud as I listen to you speak there. I think about the PropTech fraud tools that have presented over the last, let's say, 36 to 48 months. There are 12 or north of 12 different companies, to your point, and there are only so many companies that will adopt, right? Everybody will adopt it, but they'll, and it seems like, to your point, there'll be a lot of consolidation as it relates to there's just not enough business out there to support 12 different fraud oriented type technology. I'm wondering, as it relates to that, what do you think, who do you think the winners will be, just thematically speaking? if you're putting it against the biggest problems in the industry, what are the companies that are probably going to actually survive and thrive going forward?
Well, so fraud is interesting because it's clearly the most evaluated and the most implemented technology at the moment in multifamily. So there does seem to be enough demand to sustain a lot of these companies. They're all kind of a bit different in the way that they approach it, right? There's companies that are very, very focused on analyzing documents. There's companies that are very much focused on doing the deep analysis of people's actual bank accounts. There's companies that do some mixture of all of this stuff. And so far, there's enough business around to sustain most of those companies. But nevertheless, you can tell that the success of those companies is not sort of the same across the board. Like if there's 12 companies, then they're not each getting a 12th of the market. No, it's very obvious. Snappt, for example, was the earliest into this market. I think they're probably, in terms of adoption, I think they're probably a very long way ahead of everybody else. In fact, I would probably bet nobody will catch them in the end, just because that's the way multifamily tends to be. If you've got the right combination of great product market fit, easy to buy, great timing, you get to have, if you play your cards right, you get to have a sort of unassailable lead on the market. So when you look at the rest of the market, they're sort of following at different kind of paces. Various parts of that, the functionality that I just described will start to get commoditized. Presumably you'll get platform providers maybe acquiring some of these companies and bringing it into their own platform. The usual stuff that happens in multifamily. The thing I'm always looking out for when I talk to founders about this is who's got a new angle on this, who's identified a path to growth beyond the sort of status quo that we currently know about. And I can see there are companies that have that vision about them, which means if we were talking about this in a year, we'll be talking about a space that's like defined differently from how it currently is. But yeah, so lots to play out in an industry that, in a subsection of the industry that doesn't really show signs of slowing down just yet.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I want to switch gears a little bit. I think the most interesting takeaway from this paper for me personally was the customer journey disconnect is the way I'll put it, right? And I think the way you described it in the paper is that many companies out there are having a hard time. I don't know if it's defining their customer journey, but there's just so much at play that it's very hard to see the customer journey anymore. So can you unpack that piece of the paper? I found that pretty profound.
Yeah, well, this came out of a couple of the preliminary conversations that I had when I was planning what I was going to talk about in this year's interviews, and it's this idea that particularly since COVID, companies have been acquiring lots of bits of technology, right? So if I think about leasing and applications, right, I've got a deposit alternatives company. I've got a payments company. I've got a CRM. I've got an online leasing platform. I've got fraud. I've got screening. I've got all of these different things that are all made by different vendors. If I'm a third-party manager, I have multiple different combinations of all of that stuff.
That's right.
And the proposal that we put to every interviewee this year was that basically companies don't know anymore what their customer journey even is. So it's not just that it's not optimized. It's just like we actually don't know what it's like to be to be an applicant dealing with this increasingly incoherent technology stack that we've got. And basically everybody agreed with it, apart from one company who happened to have just completely reinvented everything. And they were a REIT, so they had complete control over what technologies that they used. But yeah, other than that, everyone was either just like, yes, that's completely true, or yes, that's mostly true. So if you sort of think about that, we talk a lot about customer experience. And it's one of those things. Either it's important or it isn't. But if you sort of don't even know what it is, it's quite hard to say that we really feel like we've made great strides on customer experience when at the same time we're also saying, we kind of don't know what it is.
Yeah. Do you think, I've often thought, I've even said this out loud several times on the podcast, that consumer behavior in the apartment industry is really driven by the big tech players out in the marketplace, be it Amazon, Uber, Netflix, etc. And if you're not doing business or adopting the ways of doing business of those big companies, then you're going to fall behind at some point. But do you think it's that, or it's just that, like, there's a consumer demand, so you go try to find the technology that meets that consumer demand, or you think it's just, hey, we just need to figure out something that's new and different and novel so that we look different from our competitors?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're talking about the concept of liquid expectations, right? So, if I can book an international flight and check into it and board the plane using a single app experience, that means I carry some expectation that when I come to rent an apartment,
That's right.
I'm expecting a similar level of coherence. So it's liquid expectations is the concept. I mean, I talked about it actually in much more detail in a paper that I did with Ingrain last year, like a paper about actually it was about websites. And one of the interesting, in my view, interesting ideas that got explored in that paper is this idea that we're a real estate industry, so the way we think about stuff tends to start with this real estate asset and go from there. So when we think about leasing or marketing or whatever, we're really thinking about how do we funnel leads and leases into this box, right? Into this real estate asset that we own. And we don't do what someone like Amazon would do, which is to think about what should leasing be like. I mean, we talk about it a lot. Like when I'm at AIM next month, I'm sure I'll be listening to lots of marketing presentations about what the leasing experience is like. But I just don't think companies really think about this from the prospect's view inwards. They think about it mostly from the real estate outwards. And that means you end up, each decision is about what you add into your technology stack is incrementally sensible, right? It's like, oh yeah, okay, well, this improves stuff. It's when you find that you've got a dozen plus things that you're asking a prospect to do involving different technologies, like as they go through this process of becoming a customer of yours, that you realize actually this is a bit of a mess.
Yeah.
I mean, the real problem is, remember, most of our industry is third party managed. Everyone kind of forgets that. But most of it is third party managed. And we have more and more companies that are getting funded, right? Lots and lots of small, at the margin, useful bits of technology out there, and they all know to go and sell to owners. They go to asset managers to sell their stuff. And there you've got this problem, because if from third-party management, right, that I'm not going to lose a management contract over not wanting to adopt this technology.
That's right.
And at the same time, it's not an asset manager's job to engineer the operator's customer journey. So you've got this problem that it is literally nobody's job to make this technology make sense to customers.
Yeah, that's and it's, I think every operator would benefit, and maybe some of them do this, maybe they don't, but I've leased a house and an apartment, or two apartments, in the last 6 months for my daughter, my son, so I've been through this process 3 times, one from a single family home perspective and 2 from an apartment perspective. And all of them were terrible, right? Some portion of it was terrible, right? Be it the search, or be it the actual process of getting signed up and doing your application, so on and so forth. The point I'm making is that I think every owner and or asset manager that knows that they're serving a customer would benefit from going through their own process that they built, because they're all clunky. I don't imagine many people do that. I want to switch gears. You made another interesting point, and I'll let you unpack it, but this surprising surge in renewals. So there's like this very high percentage of renewals. You've had all this supply come into the marketplace, but your renewal percentages seem to be climbing. Just, can you unpack that for us? I found that to be a pretty interesting point.
Yeah, well, that was a surprise, really, because again, going back to the interviews that we had in 2023 that we're looking forward to 2024, 2024 was not supposed to be the year of everyone's retention rates being up. 2024 was supposed to be hand-to-hand combat over every renewal. People were, especially if you were in the Sun Belt or in any of these markets that just had all this new supply out there, and people were kind of dreading it. And then 1 year later, it turns out that everybody's renewals were up, nearly everybody's retention was up, and in many cases by record amounts.
That's right.
So that was a surprise. What was very interesting, in my view, was that there was no prevailing narrative over why that was. My gut tells me it must be to do with interest rates, right? Because you've got both the supply and demand side of that. Mortgages are expensive right now, but also the current inhabitants of starter homes don't want to move out because they lose their 3% rate.
That's right.
So you've got both a supply and demand problem, which I suspect makes marginal decisions about whether I'm going to format, whether I'm going to buy a house or not. People are going to kick that can 1 year further down the road. I suspect that's probably quite a big part of this. But, I actually reached out to, during the time I was doing the interviews, I started to get interested in this. So I actually reached out to Jay Parsons, who I normally talk to about stuff like this. And I was saying, is this just interest rates or what? And he said, it's really, really multifactorial. This is before seeing what I ended up writing about this. But Jay was just telling me, I do think it's the case that people have put a lot of effort into this. People are focusing on the service elements. Maintenance above everything else is probably highly relevant in terms of renewal decisions. People are implementing technology that makes them better at running the renewal process. There's all sorts of different explanations for something that's ultimately very multifactorial. And in fact, what I did, as you would have seen in the paper, I just took my interview notes and fed them into Chat GPT with a prompt to find individual explanations of why retention rates are up, and it came up with 18 different explanations. Which from the interviews that we had, which it sort of leaves me thinking I understand even less about the cohort of people that are persuadable than I thought I did. Because I speak to vendors all the time. One of my pet peeves about the way people position technology is that people way overstate the ability of technology, service, like etc., to change people's decision about renewal. Most of the time when somebody moves out, it's not because of something that you did or didn't do. Like most of the time it's to do with life.
Yeah.
But we know there is some cohort of people who are persuadable. And I guess the experience of reviewing people's answers in this most recent round of research is that I understand that cohort even less well than I thought I did.
A topic for another paper.
Yes.
I love it. Well, it seems like I'm going to use renewals because there is a pricing component to renewals to segue to the evolving landscape of revenue management. I know you've been deeply into that topic dating back to the whole lawsuit and so on and so forth, and we don't have to touch on anything that's out of bounds, but I'm just curious, maybe high level, one of the things you cite in the paper is that there are many companies making a decision to move away from certain companies to other companies, and that hasn't been a thing for a very long bit of time. Is it just the suit that is causing that, or the catalyst for people moving from one company to another, or are there other dynamics at play?
So revenue management is interesting. It's definitely it's never been an interesting topic before in 20 for 20, because the first couple of years you just realize it's such a settled technology. It's like fallen off the senior management radar. In fact, that was the main observation, was that people are not paying as much attention to this as they should. They're just treating it as this completely settled technology. But anyway, it was just not interesting, so we stopped asking questions about it. Then in 2022, the lawsuits came along and nobody could talk about it, or nobody wanted to talk about it, so we didn't really talk about it then either. But this year, just through asking people about technology priorities, I think it was 7 out of 20 people were planning to switch platforms, right? So that's some combination of moving to a different vendor. In a couple of cases, it was companies were taking the step of building a platform themselves. They had either done it already or they were considering doing that. I don't think it's correct to say that it's it's always directly because of the lawsuits, but they are generally somehow sort of implicated in people's decisions. It's either we just want to get completely away from any kind of competitor information. One of the interesting data points is that you can see people changing both revenue management and competitor data providers, and they're sort of switching them separately from one another. So if you're considering changing platforms, the likelihood, in fact, in all cases, it was the companies were moving to platforms that used no competitor data of any description at all. So people, which is just for me as a revenue management purist, that I applaud that. I think that's really good. Like one of the things that the industry has kind of not really done itself a favor in is just associating revenue management too closely with comp data. Like in an industry that runs 95% occupancies, you shouldn't be pricing based on what your competitors are doing. You should be pricing based on how many units I have to sell and how many people I think want to rent them, because every decision is really marginal and really important. So you don't want to be delegating your pricing to the rest of the market, which is what happens when you do comp pricing. But yeah, you can see that people are moving revenue management and big comp data. So yeah, so my read on that is that people just want to get completely out of the business of having comp data be a driver of their revenue management, which probably has its origins in the lawsuits. And it's also stuff like companies don't like the upgrade options they're being offered by their incumbent vendor, so they're voting with their feet. That's the other obvious explanation for this. But yeah, it's like first time in 7 years of doing the revenue management was actually a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I want to switch gears to everybody's favorite buzzword these days. That is AI, generally speaking. But you sort of.
So I thought you were going to say centralization.
Oh yeah, no, my favorite word.
We have two favorite buzzwords then in that case, I think.
You know what, Dom? That's next.
Okay, right.
We're getting there. We can flip them around if you want to. Yeah, AI was the one that you talked about in the paper, and I think you talked about it sort of in a two lanes or two different kind of off the shelf versus like a generative AI. And just wondering if you could unpack that for us as it relates to the feedback that you got through this year's survey or this year's paper.
Yeah, it's interesting. I suspect it's an area that people are thinking about the wrong way. I've had a bit of a change of perspective on this. I think the trend is actually about automation, right? It's AI. Everyone talks about AI, and it's understandable, right? Because if you're trying to get a company funded, you need the word AI in the first sentence that you say about that company. But it's in the same way that it's wrong to talk about Salesforce.com as an HTML company, or to talk about a revenue management provider as a SQL company, or like thinking about things as AI companies, I think is slightly the wrong way to look at it. I think what we're really talking about is a trend towards automation, which happens to most of the time use AI. It's an area where every year you see this quite solid progress, right? The idea, I mean, you remember you and I a couple of years ago, whenever OpenAI came out, we did an emergency episode about, well, what do we think? What do we think about this new thing that's just everybody's talking about? You did sort of expect there'd just be this like hockey stick of everything's going to change all of a sudden. What you see is much more. I mean, you see really big progress year over year, but it's much more sort of linear than I expected it to be. Maybe that changes at some point in the not too distant future, but I think there's very solid progress that keeps being made, and this year was no exception, right? The new thing I think that I saw this year was there were maybe 5 of the companies that we spoke to that one of the biggest priorities of the year was to figure out what to do with generative AI. So it's things like how do we use OpenAI in our Microsoft Azure data environments, or what back office things can we automate using this chat capability? Or it was technology priorities like that we hadn't really seen before. So people have some curiosity and intend to burn some calories on figuring out how they can change their business using these immensely powerful tools. It's interesting. I mean, just generally, when you think about those massive LLMs, I don't think it's the case that just in the economy at large, people really understand what the big transformational use cases are going to be yet. So I don't think this is a story of multifamily really lagging behind the industry at large. But I do think I see some people who are trying to crack that particular nut over 2025. The other thing is stuff that people buy off the shelves, and we've made this observation before that if anything that's customer facing, any AI that's going to chat with customers, you buy that from a specialist vendor. Nobody's trying to solve that using large language models or doing proprietary stuff. There are lots of new sort of use cases that I think are potentially really exciting in that domain.
Do you?
If you want, I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, well, have you seen or heard about, or can you speak about any specific things? Like, I mean, we had AI leasing 6 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever it was. So that seems to be table stakes these days. So are there other things that people are doing that seem quite interesting to you that you can talk about?
Yeah, there's a couple of areas that I think are interesting. So one is voice. It seems to me that there are technologies out there that are good enough that they can have a sort of plausible conversational experience with a caller, right? So one leader who's trialing voice AIs articulated some pretty clear. This was somebody who's been using chat, a digital leasing assistant, for years, but they were talking about the improvement that voice can potentially deliver over text-based chat. And so the kind of use cases they were talking about were, we still have to have a a contact center, because not everybody will divert to chat when you give them the opportunity to do so, right? So if I'm driving a car and I call to ask a simple question, I'm not going to divert to chat, and that means I'm going to have to talk to a human in a contact center, right? There's some percentage of calls still has to get routed that way. Lots of people just don't like diverting to text either. If I call wanting to talk to somebody, I'll just wait until I can speak to a human. Well, the thesis of this particular leader was, if I can just ask somebody a question, if somebody can just call and ask a question, and they get an immediate answer, that no longer needs to be a call that gets patched through to my contact center. So it's going to have it could really reduce that remaining whatever 15-20% or whatever it is of calls that end up going to my contact center that are ultimately quite repetitive and would be easily dealt with by AI. So things like that are that's a pretty clear improvement on the purely text-based stuff. It opens up some really interesting possibilities as well, though. So if you think about, voice agents can intuit what language you're speaking. And so it's you get away from, to speak Spanish, press 9 or whatever. You get away from that completely. If it can figure out you're speaking Spanish and answer you in Spanish, that's a far better solution than what we currently have. The other one that I personally love is the idea of a voice-based self-guided tour.
Mm.
If I could experience a tour through my AirPods, right? So if I'm looking around an apartment, I don't necessarily want to be looking at my phone. I've never been a fan of the collateral that they put in properties for self-guided tours. I don't think I would like that if I was a resident in a building and it was don't forget to look at the pool, or don't all of this stuff that you see around these buildings. I've never been a fan of that. But the idea that you could have a voice agent that knows all of my preferences about that property based on the conversation that we had leading up to the tour. So, it could tell me, that fireplace that you were interested in, it's in this, you could imagine lots of value that the agent could add, but also just things like, if I could say, this living room is a little bit smaller than I thought, is there anything else I can look at? And you've got an agent that can figure stuff like that out for you. I think, I think that would be a potentially really, really good experience. The other thing that I think is interesting is in maintenance, the sort of intake problem of maintenance, where you're dealing with the person calling in the service request. There's quite a lot of value that AI can add to that transaction, right? It's generally, you don't want maintenance people talking to residents. That ends up being a very long conversation, and it's not always a great outcome from that. It's what you want is really efficient, immediate responses to somebody's request, right? You need to triage and figure out, is this really urgent or can we deal with it tomorrow? Is there a piece of advice I can give this resident so we avoid the work order altogether? Can we just tell somebody where the reset button is on their garbage disposal? Or if this is something we have to fix tomorrow, can we figure out things like, okay, the sink is blocked, which sink, which socket? So you can begin to create a really, really high quality digital record, and it will help you organize maintenance better. I think that kind of stuff is potentially very useful, and I expect will start getting quite widely adopted.
Do you, before we talk about your favorite topic, centralization, do you see, is it reasonable to think that I was sitting on a stage in December of last year, and I led a question by saying that people don't like to be commanded or controlled. You don't like to be told what to do. But in my head, it's not a far reach to think that at some point here real soon, service people are going to be directed by AI, right? Everything that you just said is now a digital record, and that digital record is going to have AI against it that helps inform your day, right? So when you show up in the morning now, John AI is telling you, you need to be here at 8:00. You need to have these parts in your toolkit, and you need to do this thing. And right after that, you need to do this thing, and this thing, and this thing, and this thing, and this thing. And you're going to have this computer telling you what to do as opposed to Charles, who is a human. I think that day is coming.
Yeah, I think so too, because if the AI can completely handle the inbound request to the point where it's scheduling you, then I don't see why it doesn't completely sort of handle triage. Because when you've created really good data about these different service requests, the thing you've now got the opportunity to do is to optimize, right? So you can figure out where people need to be in this building and what kinds of repairs they're going to be doing. And you can just allocate their time way more successfully than a human could if they're just going through a list of work orders. So yeah, I do think that's a pretty meaningful opportunity, because I don't know what the additional benefit of having humans do that is. Like you're far likelier to get mistakes. I can't believe it's a part of anybody's job that they particularly enjoy. So if you just find ways to make people more productive, because when you optimize, what you're ultimately doing is you're having people waste less of their time. I mean, you're reducing either windshield time or time spent at the Home Depot or whatever it is. You're reducing all of that stuff. Yeah. So I think there is just this great opportunity to make maintenance work better.
Yeah, I believe that to be true. I also believe there's this human nature to avoid being told what to do. Not avoid it, but you just don't like it, right? And so it's gonna be really interesting to see how humans rebel against technology. Today there are occasions where people rest in an apartment longer than they should, or they disappear, do whatever for a little bit, and it's like the AI is gonna, right? It's not gonna put up with that because you're I'm trying to optimize this, and you're railing against that, and that's going to cause conflict. It'll be interesting to see how people deal with that. So, all right, talk to us about the changing role of on-site teams as it relates to centralization. You talk about centralization a lot, and I read all about it from Dom Beveridge. So, what'd you learn this year?
So for the last few years, I've been thinking about centralization in terms of the kinds of work that people are centralizing. So I've always split it into leasing, admin, and maintenance. And this year, I'm starting to realize that that's probably no longer entirely the right way to think about it, because a couple of years ago, where it was mostly REITs that were doing this, having come from a REIT background, the way that you're typically going to think about this is, right, we have all this admin work that the assistant property manager does. Let's figure out how to put all of that into shared services, and then we're going to remove the APM role from properties. That's basically the way that like a REIT would think about it.
That's right.
So again, a couple of years ago, it became obvious to me that although just all of the talk in the industry was about leasing, all of the action was about admin. Everyone was trying to figure out how to take this, move in, move out, payments, collections, deposits, all of this stuff was just moving offsite and into shared services, and that continues to be the case. What's interesting, what I started to notice this year, is that does not mean that the APM role goes away for most companies in the same way that a REIT might think about it. Sometimes it does, but most of the time it seems that the front office roles, be they sort of leasing or admin focused, the roles change. They don't go away. So you'll find things like maybe you find that instead of having an assistant property manager, you'll have an additional leasing agent, because it's in like a lease up or in a very high touch kind of property, you might find that's a better and more cost effective way to deploy resources. You might find, for example, if you happen to have properties that are close together, what you actually do is you start to share community managers across multiple properties, and the assistant property manager gains more of some of the things that a community manager would have done, and their traditional role mostly goes into shared services. You get interesting new models that people are defining. One operator was sharing how they created an area business manager role, where instead of getting rid of the APM, they had a more senior person in that role who had a span of control of maybe 5 properties or something like that, where most of the work had gone into shared services, but there was still a human who was in charge of that. So it wasn't like they got rid of the position completely. They turned it into a role which actually they saw as being a potentially helpful stepstone to get people into regional management. So people are changing the composition of the front office staff that they had, rather than simply looking at it as, if I take all of this one person's work offsite, then I get to take that person offsite altogether. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, it absolutely does. It's interesting. Right before I left the corporate world, we were experimenting with this, and we had actually eliminated all of the assistant property manager positions, only to realize exactly what you just said. Right? We didn't let them all go. We just, through attrition and other things, we eliminated the position altogether. But we ended up backstopping that with kind of a regional support role that covered a couple of properties, right? Or in one case, we had a third party call us and say, hey, we want to put the assistant manager back in place at this particular property. It happened to be a big property, 400 or 500 units. We want the assistant manager position back, and we want some of those traditional duties given back to them. and it was because it's almost like, even though you centralize some of that work or you put it in a central place or a shared service, there still is a volume of activity that happens at the property that in the past you didn't really know about it, because it just, whatever, it happened in the normal course of business. But today, when you take all that other stuff away, oh, by the way, I actually do talk to customers. I actually do sit down and talk to Sally, who comes in, who wants to sit for 30 minutes and just dialogue, right? There are all these other things that happen at the property that don't go away just because you eliminate the assistant property manager position.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, I did some sort of deep research second half of last year with third party managers as well, because that's a very interesting segment of the market. We know that most properties are third party managed, right? So we know that most of the time when somebody's making a decision about changing roles, it's a conversation between an owner and an operator. What that tends to mean is all decisions end up being about one property at a time. So that REIT model, where we can look at, all of our properties in San Jose and decide how we're going to redeploy those, the staff that work for us at those properties. Most companies don't get to think about it that way at all. So what you find, people somewhat lose track of this, but it's always so critical to think about the fact that we're a real estate industry, which means that the context of each property ends up being really, really important in whatever you end up doing. You find, for example, that lots of third-party managers are making really solid progress on centralizing various of their functions, and it tends to be properties that are big enough that they've got 4 front office people rather than 3. So if I'm going from 4 people to 3 people, that's a lot easier than going from 3 people to 2 people in front office. So the low hanging fruit ends up being the bigger properties, where I've still got 3 people, which means I can cover the office as much as and it's not as big of a stress on that team if one role gets moved out of the property and into shared services. So yeah, it's very, very, very sort of contextual, the progress that people are making towards centralization. But yeah, last couple of years I thought about it in terms of, what roles are you subtracting from the property, and a better way to think about it is how you changing the roles that you're asking people to do in the front office.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Okay, as we move toward a close here, you kind of end cap the paper with this. I'm trying to recall it from the top of my mind. It was like a trade-off between functionality and simplicity, if I'm not mistaken. Can you kind of use that as to bring the podcast to a close? What did you learn there?
Well, yeah, I think about this more and more now. The aphorism that I keep sort of reaching for is Thomas Sowell's famous saying, "There are no solutions, there are only trade-offs," right? It's so the right way to think about technology. I'm a huge tech optimist, but I also recognize that every time you implement a technology, there's some cost that you incur by doing it. Not just the cost of the technology, but there's complexity, right? So people underestimate the complexity associated with integrations. Like, people don't like integrations; they get annoyed when they don't work, but they still don't really account for the fact that when I bring an additional integration into my stack, somebody really has to support it, or there's some additional work that my site team have to do to get around the shortcomings of this particular integration. So, every time you bring an additional vendor, an additional solution into your stack, the right way to think about it is the incremental capability that this gives me, is that better than the complexity that I'm going to bring into my stack by virtue of having another component in it? Right. So it was really interesting. A COO called me during the course of last year to ask me about, just because I've been doing a lot of work with fraud. They had a fraud vendor that they really, really liked, but they were considering moving to the generic fraud capability in their application app. And they were asking me, like, what do I lose if I go to the more generic solution? And that just struck me as a really interesting question, because I was like, okay, what do you lose? The thing you're really going to lose is you no longer have a company that's really focused on multifamily fraud, that understands how all the scams work, that understand the best ways of detecting them. Like, you lose that expertise, but this company is trading that off against what I also really, really want is for my application process to be as simple as possible. And it just struck me at the time, okay, so the answer to that is going to boil down to how much fraud do I think there is in the markets where my properties are. But what really interested me about that particular perspective was that the decision was all about this trade-off between simplicity and additional functionality. And I just don't think that's something that people think about all that much in this day and age in multifamily, which is what kind of leads us to this problem that we talked about earlier, that we just don't really understand how our stuff is supposed to work when we look at it from a customer's perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting. It brought to mind, I remember reading something or listening to Steve Jobs talk one time, and it was about the iPhone, and it was about the button, the home button, right? Or even the closed ecosystem that Apple is, and how that is a trade-off, and they were willing to make that trade-off for whatever various reasons. And they decided, hey, some customers are just not going to do business with us, and that's okay. We're okay with that. And it seems like there is a version of that for multifamily, that you're going to create an experience, whether it be for the consumer or the team member or the supplier partners that you work with, or ultimately the investors, and you're going to do your business one way. And by default, you're going to have some trade-offs, and you're probably not going to do business with some people out in the marketplace. And that's okay. That's okay. I often laugh.
It's interesting. It is genuinely quite. I think it's harder than people give it credit for to understand the actual impact that this technology has on people's businesses. Like, you occasionally meet people who've done a really good job of, we did a test versus control, trial on this, and here's what we found out. But that's sort of the sort of 1 or 2% scenario. Like, the 98% scenario is that, well, we like the sound of this capability and we like these founders, so we rolled it out. But the trouble is, once you've done that a few times, you actually have something that looks quite incoherent, and that must have a cost. It always does. I mean, the trouble is, multifamily, it's real estate, demand for it is structural. People don't come to my community because of the technology I rolled out. The effect that the technology had is always like marginal. So it's very difficult to really pinpoint what impact this stuff really has on people's businesses. But it's a messy trade-off between that and how easy did I make it for people to rent with me.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that sounds like a good end cap for me, or for us. Where can people learn more? We'll obviously link up so that people can go get the report, but where can they find out more about you online?
Well, easiest thing is to go to .com, or you can find me on LinkedIn. And yeah, the first thing you'll see on my homepage on 20.com is the annual survey.
Excellent.
You can download a free copy.
All right, Dom, it's always a pleasure. Every time I read one of these papers, I'm like blown. The mind blown emoji that you can put on your iPhone, it's fantastic. So I know I've said it before, but I really appreciate the time and effort that you put into not only the research for it, but the writing is very clear and easy to understand and very delightful to read. So thank you very much for what you do for the industry.
Thank you.
All right. And for everybody else, we'll see you next time.